Okay. My name is Mandy Giesbrecht, and I'm a district sales manager for the Nucor Tubular Group, and I'm based in Madison, Alabama. Before I introduce our guest speaker this morning, I wanted to touch on a couple of housekeeping items. So first, we'll be emailing out a recording of this call later today for those that are not able to actually attend. And then secondly, the Southeast Region Group will actually be meeting in person Wednesday, September 20th through Friday, September 22nd at the Marriott Ross Bridge in Birmingham, Alabama. So if you're new to this group or new to the Southeast region, please email myself, Mandy Giesbrecht, Clifford Drouet, or Ryan Walker to be added to the distribution list for the communications regarding these events. Lastly, once you meet in your individual cohort group after this call, please pass along any suggestions that you may have for our next cohort meeting or our next Southeast Regional cohort meeting that you might be interested in hearing more about. I believe I've muted everybody individually, but if anybody is still active with their microphone, if you would mute it, that would be greatly appreciated. And then now I would like to introduce our guest speaker. Good morning, Mr. Tim Hill. Tim is the General Manager of Nucor Sustainability Solutions Team. Tim, thank you for joining the call this morning.
Good morning, Mandy. Good morning, team. Good to be with everybody today. Thanks for making time for this. So when Clifford and I started talking about this 3 or 4 weeks ago, we really wanted to make the conversation timely. But we also understand we've got some time block with the cohort structure that we have today. So this is going to be a little bit different for those of you that have sat through any of the presentations. I see Xavier on the screen. I know he just got through sitting through listening to me talk at the sheet sales meeting. So he's probably super excited to hear this for round 2. But here's what we also know is that most of the time, in most cases, human beings need to hear something about 7 times before it really sticks, right? Where repetition is a law of learning. I know in my case, one of the things that's most helpful about doing these is that as you ask questions and as we have conversation, it helps me understand how people are hearing what we're saying. It also helps me, the reps, candidly help me understand and learn more. I research more after these, so it's really good. And as part of this, the whole point is to make this conversational. So a couple things I would ask. If we get through all of this and nobody has a question, then I've failed. Okay, so that's a do better for me. So please don't let me fail. This needs to be conversational. If you ask a question, if you have a thought, please turn your camera on, so I want to see you. I want to be able to be able to connect with you visually as we're talking. And it also helps me see and appreciate how you're hearing what I'm talking about and how you're receiving the information, which helps me as a presenter. So we're going to just talk in general about sustainability. The topic is sustainability. Okay, so I'm not going to go through a bunch of slides. I do have a slide deck. You're going to see it in September when we get together formally in person as an RCG. And the interesting thing is, by the time we get to September, the slide deck that I'm presenting on Tuesday at the RCG out west is going to look totally different than what we present Tuesday is completely different than what we'll do later in the fall. And the reason is this is an ever-evolving science that we're a part of here, right? The whole practice of sustainability is changing. The things that we know about it are changing, where our customers are changing, and as we're learning, we're embedding those into the presentations we're giving. Let's base load and level set for everybody's understanding. So those of you that have sat through a couple of these, maybe give me the grace and the opportunity here to talk to some folks that maybe haven't heard this or it's the first time they're seeing it. So when we talk about sustainability, what are we talking about? If you put it to its very foundation, we're talking about a concept called ESG. ESG is something that's been around for probably 5 or 6 years. I was going to actually research this morning. I was going to Google when's the first time ESG popped up in a conversation in business. BlackRock, the investment company, was certainly one of the early adopters in this concept of ESG investing. And what that stands for, ESG, and you'll find we have a lot of 3-letter acronyms in some of this stuff. So I'll please hold me accountable to this. If I start to rattle them off and I don't give explanation, raise your hand. But ESG in general is environmental, social, and governance. When Nucor talks about sustainability, we're really talking about one thing most of the time. And by most of the time, I'm talking 90% of the time. And that one thing falls into the environmental bucket, and that is specifically a concept called decarbonization. All right. Now, if you've been around steel for a while, you're probably scratching your head because you're wondering, how are we going to take carbon out of steel and still have steel? Well, that's not what we're going to do. That's not what decarbonization in this context means. What decarbonization means is reducing the emissions of CO2. So as we talk about carbon, carbon footprint, greenhouse gas, global warming potential, all of those terms are kind of revolving around this concept. What we're really talking about is measuring, controlling, reducing the CO2 that is produced in the operations that we have that we control in our plants, right? So that's everything from the acquisition of raw materials like DRI and pig iron. We'll talk about where those fit, the operations of our steel making and downstream units, and then ultimately what do our customers do with this material, and then where does it go when it dies, right? So that's all a part of the great story that Nucor, in particular, in the steel industry in general, have, specifically people who make steel like us, is that we have a cradle to grave concept, and we have a story and data that we can back that up with. So as you're talking to customers, it's really good to understand these things. So again, ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Specifically, we're talking about decarbonization. Now, let me put a little point out there just for you to pay attention to. The social side of sustainability is becoming more and more evident in conversations that we have with customers. So as you talk to customers, particularly manufacturing customers, if you sell things to an auto company like General Motors, or you do business with people like John Deere, or you sell into somebody who's making something, right? As opposed to a distributor who is maybe processing and then handing it off, or a fabricator who's doing some change to the product that we sell them. It's making it more useful, but that fabricator typically is in a construction application. It's a little bit different there. But if you're selling to an OEM, this whole concept around social is starting to bubble up. We're not going to talk about it today, but just be aware of it and know that there's some resources inside the company. We're prepared to talk about that. All right, so let's go back to sustainability. Let's talk about decarbonization. So first of all, I'm sure a lot of people on this phone have an opinion on where we are in this world with sustainability. Is it important? Is it not? Is it real? Is it not? Well, here's good news. Doesn't really matter what we think about this topic, okay? What it matters is there's somebody somewhere that's writing a check, they're signing a piece of paper, and they're spending money on something, whether they're building a building, a hospital, is it a municipality, is it a private developer? Are they a company like General Motors? Are they building cars, or BMW that's building cars in the United States? People that are making tractors like John Deere. I mention all these names because we're talking to all of these folks. We're having ongoing dialogue with all of these types of customers, and they're talking to us about why this is relevant for them. So if it's relevant for our customers, it's relevant for us. We're going to park the personal opinions and thoughts around the politics and the emotion that come into these type of topics. It's not really the point of our conversation today. And candidly, it can't be the point of the conversation when we're having conversation with customers. If customers want it and there's value to be created in it, Nucor wants to be on the forefront of that, and we want to lead it. And that's where we are today in our evolution, is that Nucor is positioned itself as being a leader in industrial decarbonization. So what you didn't hear me say there was that we were a leader in producing low carbon emitting steel, although we are, but we really view ourselves in a much different light. And the reason we want to position ourselves in this is that gives us an opportunity to put a narrative out there, to have messaging out there, but also thought leadership around where does this go longer term. And there is lots of voices industrially, in the industrial world, of people that are leading in some form or fashion, and they're talking a lot. The reality is nobody's got the position in the market that Nucor has. Okay, so as we start to think about us rolling out this concept of sustainability and decarbonization on an industrial scale, reducing the emissions at our operations in a tangible way, and starting at a point, by the way, that is way better than anybody else in the industry, right? We're starting in an advantaged position for a couple of reasons that we'll talk about here in a second. But where we are today is not good enough because we're not at zero, right? We still have emissions. We still have things we can do. There's still investments and innovations that we need to pursue. And by doing those things, that will help us continually get better, drive the process into our systems. And then by doing that, we'll reduce our emissions. Okay, so saying all of that, what's all this mean for us, right, in the commercial world? Well, here's what it doesn't mean. If you hear the word sustainability, the first response should not be, hey, we've got this product called Iconic and we can get it to you, right? And here's why. That absolutely may be an option, and we did create that product with intent, and it's very viable in the world of sustainability. But the way we get there and what it is unique, and it needs to be talked through. Okay, so what I would ask that you do, and let me give you a little context on how we're handling sustainability inside the company. So if you've been introduced to this in the last couple of years, at some point prior to January 1st of 2023, you probably had a reach out or a conversation with Dave Miracle or somebody on his team in Charlotte. And Dave, Victoria, and Luke basically they were one-man band. They did everything. So if it was policy in DC, they were going to DC. If it was data collection, they were going to a mill. If it was talking to a customer, they were visiting a customer. And what we realized is that they were completely overwhelmed, and we needed to really think about how we were handling the practice of sustainability. So January 1st, we split this into 3 groups of people. So first and foremost, this is being led by our customers. Our customers are driving this. So very early on, the executive team in Charlotte decided, look, this should have a commercial footprint. We need to have somebody leading and a group of people leading this in a commercial way, connecting with our commercial teams, visiting our customers, and in some ways evangelizing what Nucor is doing in the story that we had to tell. So commercial is a bucket. Dave Miracle and Victoria and Luke spend the majority of their time in the second bucket, which is policy and standards. So one of the things that's unique about what we're doing here is that while we have a great story to tell, and you're going to hear this term, you probably already heard the term green steel. There is no such thing as green steel, right? Unless you take a piece of steel and you paint it green, you can call that green steel. But in the context of what we're talking about today, there is no such thing as green steel. There is no standard globally for the production of low embodied carbon steels. Nucor is way out ahead on this, but there is no standard like ASTM A36 where you go to a standards book and you can look at what constitutes that standard that ASTM has set. What you have is an amalgamation of a lot of people's data, different process paths, different thoughts about how we get better, and a lot of people running for the finish line that is somewhere out in the future that nobody's really quite sure what it looks like. Additionally, what you also have is you have third-party reporting groups that have now formed around this industry. And you may have heard of people like CDP or EcoVadis or ISS or Design for Freedom. And these are all groups of people, very well-intentioned. Responsible Steel is another one, right? All very well-intentioned, and they have foundational things that we as a company, we agree with, right? So in the case of EcoVadis, they're focused on carbon footprint, but they're also focused on forced labor, right? So one of the foundational pieces of what they're trying to measure is they want their people that are members of their organization to only do business with people that have legitimate anti-forced labor policies in their company, right? I think everybody on this call would agree that we shouldn't be buying products that are made with forced labor. That's not a good thing. We don't support those things. But that's not something, even though Nucor has a policy on forced labor, that's not one of the things that we're really focused on in the sustainability practice. But Dave and his team in DC, the policy and standards team, they're working on this because what we need the policymakers in the United States to do is say, okay, here's the line. If your steel is made below the line, you can qualify that as green, sustainably produced steel. If it's above the line, you can't, but you need to have a plan to get below the line. All right, so all of those things kind of fit together. And again, without a standard, it's a little dangerous in some cases. It's another reason why just going to Iconic and just offering that product isn't necessarily the right thing to do. The third bucket of work, I said there were 3 buckets of work in sustainability inside Nucor. So you have commercial, you have policy and standards, and then the third one is technology and innovation. So all of the announcements or several of the announcements that you've seen regularly or recently rather, NuScale, the investment that we did with Fluor on small modular nuclear reactors, Electrosteel, which is an investment we've made out in Colorado for the creation of iron or of carbon-free iron. Okay, these are small startups. Nucor is investing in some of these new technologies. There is a laundry list of other things that we're looking at, whether it be carbon sequestration, which is basically taking the carbon that's emitted in our plants and burying it in the earth, right? That's a legitimate way to abate carbon in the market. We're looking at a lot of these things, but we have the advantage, unlike some of our competition, we don't have to pull every lever that's sitting in front of us to get better because we are already starting at such an advantage position. Again, no one has the leadership position in the market that we have today, and we have it for a couple of reasons. One, because we're an electric arc furnace steel maker and we use a high recycled content, the steel that we produce is already very, very clean. It's not zero, but it's very clean. In fact, across steel making in 2022, we emitted less than 1 ton of CO2 for every ton of steel that we produced. If you compare that across global blast furnace production, and this is the same in the United States with the blast furnaces that are in the US as they are in Europe. There's not any difference in those blast furnaces in that way. A blast furnace globally is somewhere between 2.3 and 2.5 tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced. So you can see that we already have a massive lead. But what also gives us an incredible lead in the market is the fact that we have the most diverse product mix of any steel producer anywhere in the world. Okay. So if you're selling a beam against a beam in the United States, all beams are made identical, right? So there's nothing about the way we make it at Nucor that's any better or any worse than the way that Gerdau makes it at Gerdau or SDI makes it at SDI from a carbon footprint standpoint. We can talk about all the other things that make us better, and those are legitimate things. But just looking at carbon footprint, if you're selling a beam versus a beam, there's nothing that's going to differentiate you differently. Similarly with rebar, you're selling, people don't want to buy green rebar. They want a green building, right? And ultimately, because of our product mix and because we can do everything from foundation products that are below the surface of the building you're standing in, all the way to the roof. We can do the racking and the tubing. We can do the insulated metal panels that are on the outside that clad the building. We can do the garage doors. When you roll up all of the steel that's in all of those products and you do a carbon inventory, now we have a significant advantage over the competition, and we have value that we've created for the customer. Okay, again, to wrap up, we're talking about decarbonization. We're talking about the lead that we have. And we're talking about the fact that we've broken sustainability practice into 3 groups: commercial, policy, and investments. So where are we today? As you talk to customers, there's lots of questions. People are asking for data all over the place. We actually have EPDs, environmental product declarations. It's kind of like our nutrition label for the steel that we make. We've got those now on all products. We're getting ready to post in the next 2 weeks. We will post the sheet EPDs, which is the last steel product to be posted. Now we've got updates on some products. Nucor Memphis, for instance, we don't have an EPD for them quite yet because we're going through the process. We do have for other bar mill products, but in general, all of our main steel products, we have now published EPDs or will be publishing EPDs in the next couple of weeks. Those reside today on the sustainability tab at nucor.com. Those will very soon, you'll see a slight change to how we're displaying that information. There's going to be an information gate that's created, right? So if you're a customer and you go in and you want an EPD for plate, and you click on the plate icon for a plate EPD, it's going to bring up an information gate, and we're going to ask you to fill that information out before you can download the EPD. Why are we doing that? Look, we want to make our information, we want to be transparent. We're very clear on this. We are leading in transparency, just like we're leading in sustainability. But it's also really valuable to know who's downloading your information, right? And it's valuable for all of us in commercial, because if one of your customers downloads the information, that's like a green light to give them a call and say, hey, I noticed you downloaded our plate EPD. I would love to come in and talk to you about sustainability and find out more of what we can do to help you reduce your carbon footprint, right? It's just it's a free pass to have a conversation with a customer, which is super cool for this team in commercial, right? It's an opportunity to make another connection. And what I would ask you to do is that when you get in those opportunities, reach out to us, and the us in this case is me. It's a team of one today. Sustainability Solutions, you're looking at it. Now, if we're building a team out, right? Very soon, we're going to have some announcements on some people that are joining the team, which will be great, because it's becoming a challenge to keep up with everybody's requests. But call me, email me, text me. I'm going to drop my phone number in the chat box as soon as I'm finished here. This is what I do. I get on these phone calls. I talk to our teammates. We go visit customers. We visit potential partnerships that we're making in the industry. And really what this is about is really making connection, but also informing our customers and helping educate our customers on where we are as an industry, but also specifically where Nucor is as a leader in this industry in the area of industrial decarbonization sustainability. All right. I think I've covered just about everything. Let me cover one more quick thing on Econic, because we've gotten a lot of questions. You might have a question in your mind. How come we don't just publish an extra for Econic? It would be so much easier if I could just go to an extras page and price it like we're pricing grade 50. If you come from a steel making background, you'll understand what that means. Let me just really quickly explain why. One, the value that we're creating is not not similar to a grade extra. There's not, in fact, if we go out and we create Econic, what we do is we buy offsets for scope 1 and we buy renewable energy credits for scope 2. So keep in mind, as we're talking about sustainability, and again, I'm not going to show a lot of detail around this. You'll see this, and we can certainly jump on the phone with you and go into more detail anytime. But the emissions that we have in our facilities are broken down into 3 buckets. Scope 1, it's generally the emissions at the plant. Scope 2, the electricity we use to make whatever it is you're making, whether you're making steel or you're rolling tubing. There's electricity that's used to run those machines. And then scope 3 is everything else. So it's your carbon bearing inputs, it's transportation, it's a variety of things that go into the making of your product. When we're talking about net zero Econic steel, we're only talking about scopes 1 and 2. Okay, so that's really critical to know as we're talking to customers. If they think they're getting a complete zero product from us, they are not. That doesn't exist today. There's a cost to going out and getting those offsets and those renewable energy credits. And candidly, that cost in general is probably less than $30 a ton. Okay, so if you really want to know, I mean, if there's if you have a burning platform to really know what it costs Nucor to make Econic steels, it's less in most cases today, based on the credits and the offsets that we've already bought. It's less than $30 a ton. But the market premium for that is not about what it cost us to buy those. It's about what the value is of a ton of carbon that gets reduced by buying those offsets and those credits. And globally, including North America, that ton of carbon abatement or reduction is worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 a ton. Okay. So some of the things that we heard early on from customers is when we started to talk about the cost, if they want to buy Econic, here's what it's going to cost you. They said, well, forget it. We'll just go out and buy our own credits and offsets and we'll take care of this ourselves. They actually can't do that because our steel becomes their scope 3 emission. It's not their scope 1 and 2. The only thing you can abate with carbon offsets and renewable energy credits is scope 1 and 2. So the only person that can get rid of the huge footprint that we create from scope 1 and 2 is us, right? So if you're a customer and you're buying our steel, you can buy a net zero steel, which significantly reduces their scope 3 asset, which is or their scope 3 emission, which is critically important to them to reduce their overall footprint, but they can't do that by buying offsets and credits. So they're they basically, the value that we attach to this is the value that they will pay if they want a net zero product. Okay, so we control that inside this company, which is another reason why we haven't published an extra. Because what we know from experience is typically when we publish an extra, we start to negotiate those extras and those extras go away. So instead of being a race to net zero carbon, this would be a race to net zero profit, which we don't want to do that, right? And that's not an attack on the commercial environment that we live in. That's just customers and suppliers, and that's the world we all, you guys get it. You negotiate every day. You know how these things go. And legitimately, to abate a ton of carbon is really expensive. Carbon offsets and renewable energy credits are a bridge. That's not how we're going to really truly abate the carbon. That's just a starting point to get us there. And that's why we've offered it. We've offered it very intentionally. We've got plenty of it to sell. There's not a, I think there's been some misnomers in the market about, oh, well, we don't have enough to meet customers' needs. Not true. We won't sell it to a service center. Also not true. You just absolutely have to understand what it is we're talking about, who we're offering it to, and what value Nucor is bringing to that whole relationship. Okay, so I'm 28 minutes in. I'm going to stop talking because I want to leave some time for questions. I'm open it up to anybody to hit me with a question. And then if we're running out of time, reach out. We'll jump on another call. I'll do another group call, jump on one-on-one, whatever you need me to do, and we'll explore this more deeply. Who's got a question? Don't make me have to call on Scott Pate. Oh, yeah, Johnny. Good morning.
How about elaborating a little bit on our circular steel value proposition?
Yeah,
how
absolutely.
it fits into, into all this equation of sustainability.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. That's a great question. Let me touch on that really quickly. So everybody, I won't say everybody because I shouldn't make that assumption. Most everybody on this call probably understands the concept. When I say electric furnace making steel, you probably understand what I mean. We make steel at our steel mills using an electric furnace. And the basic raw material that we use, in fact, I think in 2022, 79.4%, I think I'm right with that number, was recycled content, right? So essentially it's the junk, it's the scrap that we buy every month that we put in our furnaces, and that's the base of what we use to make steel. That concept is circular. What do we mean by circular? Well, we all appreciate and know that steel is infinitely recyclable, right? So when you finish using that, the automobile you have, or the washing machine in your house, the water heater, the building parking garage that gets tore down in the neighborhood, or I flew into Memphis last night late, and they're finally getting rid of those old terminals, and there's just a pile of structural steel and old rebar sitting in stacks, right? All that scrap is going to work its way to a scrapyard. We're going to buy that and we're going to melt that to make new steel. Okay, that concept is called circular steel making, and we've changed the terminology to help people understand what we're talking about. Because when we talk about people outside of our industry, like steelmaker people, when we talk to our customers or engineers or architects, and we say, well, that's BF steels and we do EAF. They look at us and they're like, what the heck are you guys talking about? We don't understand that. But think about the visual that comes in with circular steel making, right? There's a circularity of what we do. We take garbage, we make new stuff, we put it into the market. Eventually that has an end of life and it goes back to the scrapyard, which comes back into a steel mill, and we start that process over. It's circular, right? We connect that to our customers, and with the help of industrial recycling, the part of the DJJ group, which is part of the Nucor family. I'm sure there's some industrial folks on the call with us. They help us plug into those customers that are producing that product so that we can get it into our pipeline quicker and save the step of going into a scrapyard. We can get it right off the production line at an OEM and right into our steel mills. Okay. Contrast that with our competition that makes steel in a way that we've dubbed, and you're going to start to hear these terms in the market. It's extractive steel making. Well, think of the visual around that, right? You're digging in the ground to dig ore and limestone and coal, and you're blasting it in a furnace with a huge amount of energy, which has got a massive carbon emission footprint, right? So let's think about that, right? It's going one direction. It's not circular. we pick up the value of the circularity in our process. It's extractive because they're digging out of the ground and they're using a massive amount of energy to make that steel. So as you start to see presentations from Nucor, you'll see these terms. We use a circular process. They use an extractive process. Circularity is very clean. It's very efficient. It's what made Nucor successful, and we're going to continue to lean into that. Extractive is not the future for steelmaking. And candidly, I was in Europe about a month ago at a steel conference, and all of the major steel producers were there. All the major European steel producers were there. We were the only American steel producer there, which I'm pretty sure by the time the conference was over, they wish they wouldn't have asked us because our story was dramatically better than theirs. But everybody in that conference said the answer to their problem was they were going to shut their blast furnaces down. They were going to build EAFs and build DRI plants. And they were going to replicate the Nucor model. Everybody, I mean, everybody said that. SSAB, ArcelorMittal, ThyssenKrupp, Salzgitter, Tata Steel, all of the major steel producers were there, and they all used the same. They could have used one. They could have just gotten up on the stage and made one presentation, saved everybody the hassle. But that's the difference between circular and extractive. Thanks for the question, Johnny. Hopefully that's helpful for everybody. What else?
Hey, Tim. I know you mentioned SSAB, one of our competitors out of Europe, and they're currently doing a hydrogen-based product. And now, obviously, there are some problems with that energy, the energy inputs, the scalability of it. But innovation doesn't always come out perfectly the first time. And I know you mentioned some investments. Are we looking at a similar process? I mean, I don't know what you can get into, but it seems to be
super
exciting.
That's an awesome question, Greg. Thank you for asking it. So let's just touch on that really quick. So what Greg's referring to is, blast furnaces use a bunch of natural gas, right, in the process. So natural gas naturally is dirtier than other, potentially dirtier than other things. Although ironically, the only way hydrogen is really going to be cleaner is if it's made using renewable energy. Now, what makes SSAB's concept very unique is that they're in Sweden and they have a massive amount of hydroelectric available to them, which is renewable. So they can actually make green hydrogen. It is a thing, right? And there's a process to make green hydrogen. They can do it. They likely, as you pointed out, Greg, it's a fair point. Innovation is never clean. It's never easy. It's never cheaper, but eventually it gets there, right? The first cell phone that was made, weighed like 100 pounds. It looked like a brick and it was super expensive. Today, you can go to Walmart, you can buy them for almost nothing, right? So you get it. Candidly, half the time they give them away for free. So you get that through the innovation cycle, things get cheaper. That will happen with hydrogen as well. Now, the challenge that Sweden has, just as a footnote to that, and SSAB touched on that, they need to create a massive amount of renewable electricity in that country that doesn't exist today. They've got the hydroelectric capability, but they don't have that electrical grid that's built out today. So there's still a huge expense to doing that. In the US, green hydrogen's getting talked about. People are approaching us regularly talking about that. That is not one of the levers we're going to pull. And the reason is this. One, it's going to be a long time before green hydrogen is economical in the United States. Okay. Even with the tax credits, it is still right now, after you take the tax credit, it is 5 times as expensive as using natural gas is today. Okay. Secondly, the only place that we're really using natural gas to that level would be at DRI as a reductant in the process of making DRI. We think we have some other technologies at DRI that'll help us capture those emissions, and hydrogen isn't the thing we're going to look at as an innovation. But let me put this note in your mind. We still want to be really close to what's going on with hydrogen, and here's why. There's a huge build out of the hydrogen business in the United States that is likely to happen. So what do we know with that? All of those hydrogen terminals, they're all going to be built with steel. That's point number one. Then there's going to be pipelines that are also going to be built with steel. That's point number two. Thirdly, we really believe, and as I talk to our technology team, they believe that transportation in the United States, long haul trucking, it's not going to be EV. It's going to be hydrogen fuel cell likely in the future. So as we've got partners. Obviously, we don't do anything if we can't get our steel to the people that need it, right? And we rely on the trucking industry in a big way to move our steel from point A to point B. We should absolutely care, and we do absolutely care what's going on in hydrogen. and the hydrogen creation in the United States. We're going to stay very close to that. We'll support people that are growing that, but it isn't one of the technology levers that we're going to pull to reduce. Not today. We'll keep our eye on it, maybe in the future, but today that's not one of the things we're looking at. Great question, Greg. Thank you. What else?
Hey, Tim, it looks
Ken,
like,
this is
sorry,
Ken
I
Nichols.
saw Ken.
Okay. Yeah, thanks,
Hey,
Mandy.
Ken.
Yeah, my speaker's not working right, so I typed it in the chat, but thank you, Mandy. I was at a chapter meeting of MSCI this week in Quebec.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, ArcelorMittal was there and gave a presentation, and their entire presentation was around how green they're getting in Canada because they're moving to EAFs there, and they got about, I don't know, 450 million from the Canadian government to do so.
That's right.
But then the next comment was, and we're almost, we almost have our responsible steel certification. So I'm sure the audience sitting there was tying the two together.
Yeah.
And I think what you just said, I think for this audience here, maybe educate us a little bit on the difference between responsible steel and the steel climate standard for the GSCC that Nucor's involved in.
Absolutely. Great point, Ken. Thank you. So first thing, I need you to write down two websites, and I need you to get on and look at these two websites. So the first one's responsiblesteel.org. Okay. So if you haven't looked at it, you need to look at it. This is our competition. If you want to be up on what the competition's doing, I strongly recommend you spend some time thinking about it. The second one is gscc.org. And that is a nonprofit that Nucor was a founding sponsor of. And there's other people there that you'll know. SDI is a member of it. CMC is a member of it. Celsa is a member of this. Taiwan Steel is a member of it. So it's not just Nucor. It's not Nucor hiding behind a nonprofit. This is a variety of steel makers in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia. There's over 35 members now that have joined. Okay. But to Ken's point, people are throwing around responsible steel. So I'll take you back to that European Steel Conference to give a little bit of context. Okay. So Tata Steel India got up, and they did a presentation about how for 5 years running, they've been awarded the Responsible Steel Leadership Award. Okay. So they, according to Responsible Steel, they're a leader in sustainability globally. Then they showed us their data for 2022, and their carbon emissions in their production plant in India were over 3 tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced. Okay. So then they showed their 10-year plan. And so their plan by 2030 is to hopefully get their carbon footprint down to below 1.8 tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced. All right. Keep in mind that our 2022 average was 0.76 across Nucor steelmaking. All right. Now, to Ken's point, here's the problem with Responsible Steel. Responsible Steel has some really awesome pieces to who they are. But about a year and a half ago, they created a steel standard. And why did they create a steel standard? Because they saw what was happening in the globe, and they knew they were about to be out-positioned in the market. And what that steel standard says is they use what's called a sliding scale. So they actually have a scale that's on there. If you investigate it on responsiblesteel.org, keep me honest, get on there and look it up. There's a steel standard. Look it up. There's a chart. And that chart to the far left has recycled content on one axis, and on the horizontal axis, it talks about tons produced or tons consumed. And so what they're suggesting is somebody that has a low recycled content, basically extractive steel makers that have a high carbon output, a high carbon footprint, they're green because they don't use a lot of recycled content. But then somebody like Nucor, all the way over to the right, that has a high recycled content, they should be held to a much tighter standard to be called green. Okay. Now, if you walk up to just an average Joe on the street and you showed him that graph and said, okay, is this the same as this? No one in their right mind is going to be like, oh yeah, that's totally the same thing, right? But that's what they're advocating. The reason they're advocating in this is because the other thing that has come out is, and McKinsey just released a study about 2 weeks ago, for the European steel community to do what they need to do to reduce the carbon footprint. Pay attention to this number. It's going to cost them at a minimum $1,200 a ton of steel produced to make the conversion. When we were in Europe, they voluntarily said they believe the premium in Europe for flat steels, plate and sheet, in the next couple of years will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 300 euros per ton to be able to pay for the investments that they need to make to reduce their carbon footprint. Okay. Now, what GSCC, the group that Nucor is leading, what we've said is that is not right. You can't use a sliding scale. That's wrong. That's not green. Just because you're calling yourself green does not make you green. We're calling on policymakers across the globe to say there's a line for carbon emissions in steel plants. If you're above the line, you're not green. If you're below the line, you are green. And additionally, what's your plan to reduce that to as close to zero as you can get? You've got if you look at what GSCC is proposing, their proposed standard is on the web. We're giving people 2 years to figure it out, come out with a plan. So it's not like, all right, well, tomorrow, next Tuesday, if you're not at a number, you're not green anymore. It's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is policymakers, and what's really important for this group is customers should not be duped into believing that responsible steel is really responsible steel. And the unfortunate thing is, to Ken's point, is we have competitors out there that are doing a linkage process in their conversations with the customers, and they're linking those things together, I doubt ArcelorMittal said that those two things are the same, but what they didn't do is say that they were different. That's up to us to make that designation. That's why it's so critical to get in front of your customer. And if they're not asking you about this, you ask them about it. And don't stop until you find somebody in their organization that's talking about it. Because I will promise you this, if it's an OEM, particularly if it's a manufacturer, or if it's a fabricator that's substantially changing how that steel looks when it leaves our plant, they care. Somebody in their organization is getting pinged on this, and they want more information. And if we can be the education, think about that. We can clear up some of the mistruths and the false news that's out there about what sustainability is and who really truly is the leader in this market. So great point, Ken. Thanks.
Yeah, and Tim, to your point, I mean, dead on. I bet you there was 85 to 100 people in that room, and every single one of them probably left with the connection in their head that going to EAF and responsible steel was why they were up for that certification, and we know that that's not the case.
Yeah.
So.
And along those points, let me make this is critically important for everybody, since you're commercial people and you're making presentations to customers all the time. Couple things. One, if you've got a PowerPoint that's been created anytime since, before January 1, and actually anytime in the last 2 months, get rid of it. If it has anything to do with sustainability, just trash it. And here's why. We've created new documentation. We've got a master customer pitch deck that talks about sustainability in a variety of ways. We talk about it from an automotive focus. We talk about construction. We talk about energy. We have just dozens of slides in a master pitch deck. Okay. We're keeping that data updated all the time out of Charlotte. It's in a team site. I'm happy to send you a link to it, but you got to understand what you get. You can't present it in its raw form, because there's just a bunch of data in there and it'll just wipe somebody out. What I would ask is, if you have an opportunity to go into a customer, I'm happy to do one of two things. One, I'll sit on a Teams call like that. We'll build a slide deck. We'll curate a slide deck and some information specific to the audience that you're going to see. And we'll do one of two things. I'll either get on that phone call. In fact, I would prefer to get on that phone call with you and walk through the process with you of talking to the customer. Or if that just doesn't work and you want to go it alone, we're totally good with that. We will prep you and make sure that you've got the talking points and that you know the data, the information. And again, we'll have those slides that are custom made, and that includes the pictures of what we're talking about. So if you're going in and you're calling on Volvo truck, we're going to produce a slide that's going to have a Volvo truck in the background of that slide so that it's relevant and it's timely for the audience that we're presenting to. Okay. So you don't feel like you got to do this by yourself. We are here with resources, and that's what we're doing. What else? I know we're getting close to time, and I don't want to push into the cohort times, but this is, I'm excited that we've got information here going. So what else?
Hey, Tim, on the social side of it, I know I've had a couple of requests from Nissan and I think Mercedes about certain regions in China that we don't source raw materials from, and I got with people and our environmental, and we drafted something that we could send them. In the future, are we going to have documents like on Nucor now at the ready for them to come up? Or are we going to handle them as one-offs?
Great question. So a couple of things on that. Dustin, I appreciate that question a lot because it's happening more and more. So one, as I kind of pointed out at the beginning, be aware that you're probably going to get a question. We already have a document created. It's on Nucor.net. It's on Nucor.com under the sustainability page. Nucor has a formal forced labor policy that we created. Now, the good news with Nucor is very little of what we buy comes from regions of the world that we're concerned about. But one of the big ones is pig iron that came from Brazil, and specifically in the northern part of Brazil, which is not the same as buying pig in the southern part of Brazil. We have changed our purchasing strategy, and we have traceability back to our vendors in Brazil. And there's a policy that we created around forced labor that also refers to what we did specifically in Brazil. Now, that said, here's the other piece to this. Every time a customer asks us a question, we don't have to give them 100% of the information they're asking for. And here's what I will say with that. And I'm not trying to be hard to do business with. I know we want to be transparent. I'm not going back on that. That is really super critical. But the reality is sometimes we have to understand who's really asking the question. And there is there's a group of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that sometimes are in the background of some of these questions that are being asked through our customers. And some of those activities are what we would refer to as gotcha activities, right? So they're trying to get us to say something. And then the next thing you know, 2 days later, there's a Wall Street Journal article where somebody's citing that Nucor did something nefarious and what we said is not what we did, okay? So we want to be very intentional and very careful how we answer these questions. I would say if you get a social-based question, bring that to my attention right away. We'll get the right people engaged in the conversation. Certainly your environmental managers, that's fine. But I need to know, keep me in the loop on what's going on, because we've got standards, policy, government affairs people, corporate communications people. And if you're getting asked the question, chances are somebody else is getting asked the question too. We want to make sure that we tailor our response from an enterprise standpoint so that we answer it appropriately and that it can't be used against us. In most cases, we can answer the question and we can give them traceability that they're really looking for. And in 99% of the times, it's completely innocent. Somebody's asking them, they just need an answer. But we want to be very careful how we answer it and stay consistent with our answers. Good question.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah. What else?